The message this morning is we worship God, not government. Or to put it a different way, we're looking at when government says to stop worshiping God this morning. Let's just make a few things very clear. I don't want to be misunderstood today. We respect our government very much. Amen? We respect the government when they do good. We respect what they do. We respect the good things that they do. We are to honor leaders. We are to honor those in authority. That is what the Bible tells us to do. We are to give honor to those whom honor is due. We are to obey the government. Now, we're going to talk about that today, aren't we? But we are, the Bible says, to obey the government. And really and truly, we should want a government. The Bible says that God created government. God ordained government. I would not want to live in a society without government. That would lead to chaos. Now, we can talk about what type of government that needs to look like. But the fact is, we need government. We need police. We need all these things in society. God has ordained these things in society. We are to pray for our government. We are to pray for our leaders. The Bible tells us that. When you think about a government, Christian citizens should be the best citizens in any country. They pray for their leaders. They want to obey the government. They want to do what's right in the government. They want their government to do the best. Christians ought to be the best citizens in any government. However, if all that said, we do not worship the government. And as we've talked earlier, just taking prayer requests and speaking to each other, today what we see in many places, and even at times in this country, is a government that desires and wants us to worship it. And that is when the government crosses the line, and we as Christians must say, though we honor authority, though we want to obey authority as much as we can, though we want to submit as much as we can, we want to pray, we cannot worship anyone but God. What we see in Daniel 6 today, and I trust this account is familiar to many of us, we see a type of persecution that we haven't seen so far in Daniel. I think this is very important to see. In chapter 3 that we looked at, we saw Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we saw King Nebuchadnezzar command them to bow down before an idol of gold and worship it or die. So what we saw, and this is what we see often in the Bible, we see whatever it may be, government, it may be just some individuals, they want to force God's people to worship idols. That is one form of persecution. That form of persecution still exists today. What we see in Daniel 6, and this is the important part, is different than that. In Daniel 6, you see not that the government is telling us to worship an idol, but you see the government is telling us to stop worshiping the one true God. That's the difference. That's the difference here. And it's very important for us to see this. And I cannot think, it would be hard for me to think of, and I would imagine for us here today, it would be difficult for us to think about a truth more relevant today. And I've said this over and over. You do not have to make the Bible relevant. You just have to read it. You have to open it up. You have to expound on it. It is relevant today. It's irrelevant for every generation, every society. So what I want us to see today are three different things. I want us to see, first of all, the situation. I want us to see, secondly, the act. And then thirdly, I want us to see the judgment. That's what I want us to think about this morning. First thing I want us to see is the situation. What is the situation that Daniel finds himself here? He finds himself in government overreach, is what he finds himself. You know, it's really amazing here in Daniel 6. We're not going to read the whole chapter. In Daniel 6, Daniel is in the government. Daniel, under the king, is in the top 3 positions in government. In fact, this chapter tells us that Daniel is doing so well that the king is getting ready to exalt him over all the government except for the king himself. And because of that, some of the people here in the kingdom began to get jealous of Daniel. And they come together and they make this scheme. And I want you to look at this. We're going to pick up in verse 6, and we'll read down to verse 9. And we're going to see the situation that Daniel finds himself. It says, "Then these commissioners, the satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes, now listen to this, that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den." And notice here, before we go on to read, this is the principal problem that we see in government sometimes. It's not government, so to speak. It's the people who run the governments. What you have here, the trouble begins with a king who is willing to receive prayer and worship for himself. That's where it begins here. And if you know the story, you know the king is going to try to get out of this. He wants Daniel to be freed, but it's too late. This king, though, is willing to receive worship, and what we find today in many governments around the world, including our own, are little gods running around desiring worship. And that is why they decree to do what they decree, because they believe they're above God, they believe they're above God's law, and they want worship from people. Men and women desiring worship, therefore they will go along with this. And look what it says in verse 8, or verse 7 again. For 30 days. It's just 30 days. Now just think of this. Think of the temptation for Daniel. Daniel, all you have to do, you're an old man now. That's where Daniel's at. He came in 605. Daniel, this is now 530 something. He's advanced in age. He's been faithful his whole time. Think of the temptation here. Daniel, you can forget about those lions. All you have to do, you've been faithful your whole life for 30 days, Daniel. That's all you got to do, is to stop worshiping God. After that, everything goes back to normal. Let's pick back up in verse 7. For 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document. That is the injunction. So what we have here, we have a government who is telling its citizens. I want to ask two important questions later about this. But we have a government telling its citizens, or its subjects, stop worshiping the true God just for 30 days, or we're going to kill you. Just 30 days. 30 days, that's it. What I want you to see here at the beginning is our day is no different than Daniel's day. I'm going to give you some examples here before we move on. He's already been mentioned. He was mentioned last week. He is worthy to be mentioned again. Pastor James Coates in Canada is in jail today for the crime of doing what? For the crime of continuing having church services with more than 15% capacity. He's in jail today, and they have not released him. They have released other people because of coronavirus, my understanding is. They will not release him. I don't know their motives, but I would say to make an example out of him, so other churches won't follow suit. He's in jail today for simply doing basically what we are doing right now, and what we have been doing now for months and months. He is very similar. And this is this is a discouraging thing. If you followed this on the internet, what you see are people really going at him for being irresponsible, people really bringing him down, and guess who these people are? They're professing Christians who are saying these things. Now, no doubt there's secular people saying these things as well, but they're Christians who saying that he acted irresponsibly. Why not love your neighbor? How can you do this? Aren't we supposed to obey the government in his case? And there's other Christians bad-mouthing this pastor who's got a family, a wife, and children, and he's in jail because of his conviction. Other Christian people are saying things. Even not only in Canada, but in America as well. This is very similar to John Bunyan. I love John Bunyan. You've heard me talk about John Bunyan, wrote The Pilgrim's Progress in prison. Why was he in prison for? Well, in part because of a 1593 law that said this in part. To come to or be present at any unlawful assemblies, conventicles, or meetings, under color or pretense of any exercise of religion, contrary to Her Majesty's said laws and statutes. Bunyan was in jail in part because he refused to stop preaching. He said, if you release me today, I'll preach tomorrow, is what he said to them. He could walk out free, just like James Coates can. All John Bunyan had to do, he had a wife, he had kids, he had a little daughter that was blind that he loved so much and he couldn't go see her. All he had to do was stop preaching. He said, I can't do that. He was left in jail. For year after year after year, he had some leniency here, but he was in jail. He was in jail. You know the reason we remember him? Because he was in jail and wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. Satan can't beat God. Satan's not going to win. God's going to win. Bunyan was in jail because he said, I will preach and we are going to gather together. We are going to do what's right. Even if Her Majesty's laws say something else. We see this overreach happening in Victoria, Australia. Listen to this law. It's a long law. Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Act 2021. Now what's this all about? What's this law that's been passed in Victoria, Australia? One intention of this act of Parliament is this: to affirm that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity is not broken and in need of fixing. Okay? But what's prohibited in this law in Australia, in Victoria? Partly this. Carrying out a religious practice, including but not limited to a prayer-based practice, a deliverance practice or exorcism. If some things happen, and you know somebody, and there's more to this law, I will say this, but you're praying that God would deliver them from their sexual sin, and you keep doing it, especially like in a church gathering, if we do that, you could be fined, you could be imprisoned up to 10 years. It's the thought police. You see, we read back in Daniel 6 and we say, wow, that was pretty bad. In Victoria, Australia, they're saying you can't pray in certain ways right now. Just like they said to Daniel 2,500 years ago. We've talked about France recently. Let's talk about the U.S. now, our country. We have churches right now, or at least in the past, that were not allowed by the government to meet. We have churches right now where they can meet, but they can't sing. What's going on? What kind of overreach is this? The Equality Act has passed the House. Let me read a part of a writing from a lady named Sarah Parshall Perry. She's with the Heritage Foundation. She says this about the Equality Act. Particularly targeted by this sweeping bill are 1, biological women, 2, religious Americans, and 3, parents. If you happen to be a religiously observant biological woman who is also a parent, as I am, this bill portends the assassination of not only what you believe, but who you are and what your children learn. This is happening in our country right now, friends. This overreach, this attack upon God-given rights. It's man trying to be God. It is what we've seen over and over in the book of Daniel. We have seen earthly kings and earthly leaders trying to usurp the authority of God on earth. In Daniel, it's made so clear that He's God in heaven and He's God on earth as well. He does not give up His throne on earth. He is Lord of earth. And the government needs to submit themselves under the lordship of God as they govern and carry out what God has ordained for them to do. And like I've said already, one of the worst things is people who are making these laws in different countries, many people who are making fun of Christians who are resisting, they themselves are religious. That's what's disturbing. It'd be one thing if it's just a secular state. We know this, don't we? Though certainly secularism is growing in our country is very religious still. People in Congress, by and large, are very religious still. They're religious people, sometimes at least, who claim the name of Christ, who are persecuting God's church today. Now, that's the situation. Secondly, I want you to look at the act, though. What was the act of Daniel? It was obedience. It was obedience is what Daniel did. Look in verse 10, chapter 6 of Daniel. Now when Daniel knew, Daniel's not acting in ignorance here. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. What's Daniel's response? Once he knew this law, once he knew the law said for 30 days you can't pray to anyone but the king or you'll be thrown to lions, once he knew this, he kept on worshiping God just like he'd always had. He was obedient. He was obedient. I got 2 questions for us this morning. Number 1, did Daniel sin in disobeying the government? Did Daniel sin? I think all of us, I'm not going to take a survey, I think every one of us here this morning would say, of course, Daniel did not sin. That's clearly what the Bible is portraying for us. And I would hope that each and every one of us believe that Daniel did not sin. I want us to look at a few scriptures before we look at the second question I want to ask you. One is in Romans 13. I want us to look at Romans 13. This is the passage that sometimes is abused, sometimes is ignored. We don't want to do either of those things. But this, when we think about obedience to the government, by the way, the majority of our life as Christians ought to be in obedience to the government, right? We don't disobey the government because we have different preferences. We don't disobey the government perhaps because there's just something little that we don't agree with. If that was the way that we lived, we would be our own government, right? So this has given us the general law, the general principle of the Bible, normally speaking. Romans 13, let's just start in verse 1. We're going to look at this passage and then a few more passages on this point. Let's just start reading. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by God. That does not mean that God's pleased with how every authority is acting. But know this, that God has set up authorities. Verse 2, therefore whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. Now that is a fearful thing. It's a fearful thing to disobey the government. It's not something Christians just run off and do and we're just happy about and all that. No, this is government set up by God, the Bible says. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. Now that's a true ruler. When a person does good, they should not fear the governing authorities. What we see very often in our day is when you do good, you are going to fear, because our governments at times are so corrupt now. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Now listen to this very carefully. Verse 4. What is government? And if any official happens to listen to this sermon ever, he needs to listen to this part. What is his position as as an official. Verse 4, for it is a minister of God. What is the government? It's a minister of God. What are officials? They are ministers of God. They serve God in their capacity. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Evil according to whom? Evil according to God. According to God. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due to them. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Who is the Caesar at that time, probably when Paul is writing this? It's Nero, who's going to cut his head off one day. So we do have a high standard as Christians to obey, to submit. That much is clear. But this is what I want us to see, and it's so important, and this is what I fear many Christians are missing. Acts chapter 4. It's not that we run off and we do whatever we want as Christians, and we say, well, we're higher than the government. We're not higher than the government as individual Christians. But what we have to see is this. There's wisdom involved, yes. We want to be wise. God gives us wisdom. But what we have to see is when an authority says this, it's not that it's against our preferences, it's not that it's just something small over here that doesn't really matter, but when an authority says this, and God says this, and this authority, if we obey it, will make us disobey God, that's when a Christian must say no to that authority and say yes to God. Because ultimately, God is over every authority. He's everyone's authority. You see that in Acts chapter 4. You see something of this, verse 19 and 20. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. They say, you be the judge. If it's right to obey you or God. You be the judge, but we're going to obey God. Look in chapter 5 of Acts. Again, as we read these, I don't want us to get this thing within us, well, we're just going to do whatever we want no matter what. It doesn't matter. That's not the spirit of Christianity. But this is part of what a Christian is. We have to obey Him. When even authority that's under God tells us to disobey God, we must in fear say, no, we will obey God. That's what we're looking at. Chapter 5, verse 27 starting. When they had brought them, they stood them before the council. The high priest questioned them, saying, we gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name. And yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. There would be no church today if the church had not obeyed God rather than men at times. Pastor James Coates' wife, you know one thing that she said? They had a rally outside of the prison or outside of the jail where he's held. And she said one thing that people can do is that churches can start to open up their doors again. Most churches up there aren't opening their doors, I suppose. And she says, open up your doors. We see here Peter says, we must obey God rather than men. All the apostles were with them. So did Daniel sin in what he did? The answer obviously is no. Daniel was a good servant of those different governments he was under. He wouldn't have been in the position that he was in if he had not been. He had served even King Nebuchadnezzar faithfully. After Nebuchadnezzar was going to kill his friends, he still served him faithfully. When Nebuchadnezzar got the dream that showed that he was going to be struck down, Daniel felt in his heart, no, I just wish it wasn't about you. This is a man that tried to kill his friends. Daniel loved his government. He loved his society. He wasn't just bucking everything. But when he had to decide to whether obey the government or obey God, Daniel said, I must obey my God. He didn't sin. Here's what's going to happen. It's already happening, and here's the thing. It's already happening in Christian circles. People are saying, well, why can't you just meet online? Other churches are doing that. Just meet online. It's the same thing. And what I would say to us is this, it's not the same thing. Now, if that's all someone can do, they've been in an accident or something happens and they feel maybe for a short time they need to stay home, I'm glad we have online stuff. I'm very glad about that. So don't misunderstand me. But if someone is able and it's right to come, that's the only way to fulfill God's command is to attend a house of worship. Let me just turn to a passage we've looked at in the past, Hebrews 10. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Do not forsake the assembling. Now look in verse 24. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. You see, going to church service, though most certainly preaching and teaching is a main, if not the main, that prayer is, I don't want to make one higher than the other right now. They're all very, very important. But you cannot fulfill the commands of God by simply watching online or listening to a sermon. We as Christians are to get to know the people we go to church with, church services with. We are to minister to them. We are to love them. We are to stimulate them to good works. We cannot do that behind a TV screen. And that's why when even Christians at times say, well, let's just go make an online church, what they're saying is this, let's not have church anymore. Because the very definition of the word church is to assemble. That's what it means. And that's one reason I'm so big, at least once a week, let's get all the families together and meet together, children and all. Why? Because that's what the word church means. Everyone assembling together. Everyone assembling together. So did Daniel sin? No, he did not sin. Here is the second question I want to ask you though. Daniel was a government official. He was besides the king, besides the one who ruled the kingdom, Daniel was in the top 3, getting ready to even move up as in the government at that time. Here's the question for you then. Would Daniel have sinned if he did not pray? This is what I want us to think about now. We're not asking about Daniel as an individual Christian. We're asking about Daniel as in the government. Because here is what I think many people think. They see somebody who's somewhere in the chain of authority and they have somebody here. And say I'm that person in that chain of authority. I'm not the top, but I'm somewhere there. I'm in that authority line. And I'm getting ready to carry out something that clearly, again, it's not preference. It's not just something little here that we could have it could go either way. I, as an authority figure, I'm getting ready to carry out something that completely goes in the face of what God commands. Am I going to be held accountable for that? You see, most people just say this. Well, I'm just doing my job. That's all I'm doing. That's all I'm doing. I'm under authority. I'm just doing my job. I'm carrying out. Hey, don't blame me. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. Daniel could have said, you know what, Lord, I'm just in the chain of authority and it's only going to be for 30 days And I know this is wrong, but it's not my fault. It's the king's fault. I'm just not going to pray these 30 days. We all know that would be sin. And I think we all know, I hope, that when an authority figure who's under authority attempts to carry out something that is deliberately against the clear will of God, that person is sinning, and he is called upon not to do that thing. I think it's very important for us to see that here. Just because we're under authority does not mean we can carry out evil things in society. Just because somebody in the government, he may say, I'm sorry that we have to bust into your house and take your godly children away from this godly home, but that's what the government's telling me to do. I'm sorry about that. It's not me, it's the government. No, it's that person's duty to say, I'm not going to sin against God's clear, revealed will. I'm either not going to do this or I'm going to quit. Whatever it is, I'm not going to carry out evil in society. Daniel was a government official, and he still prayed because that was the right thing to do. The right thing to do. I want you now to see the judgment. Look in verse 21 and following. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent His angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before Him. And also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. What I want you to see here is God's judgment. And usually when we use the word judgment, we use it as condemnation. Obviously that's part of this. But when I use the word judgment right now, I just mean Him rendering judgment. What did He render? Number one, He rendered this: Daniel is innocent. Number two, He rendered this: these evil men are guilty and they will pay. Here's what I want you to see today. Whether in this life, like the story we just saw, or whether in the next life, God will reward those who do good and He will punish those who do wicked. And I can tell you, if things don't change, I fear we're going to see things get worse and worse, more dangerous. Persecution's going to come to our country, to our churches, to our preachers, to our Christian homes. And we have, by the grace of God, to be willing to risk everything to obey Him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did this. Daniel did this. Our Lord Jesus Christ did this. He would not bow to Caesar. He would not give in to the Jewish leaders. He went to the cross and died for us, that we might be forgiven, that we might be saved, if we'll come to Him humbly. Polycarp did not do this. The early Christian martyrs did not do this. Free Will Baptist forebearers did not do this. Other traditions forebearers did not do this. And today we see across the world men and women who will never be named and never be known, but they're known by God. They have said, we will not do this. We will obey God. And as a church, I want us to be ready. I want us to know God's will on this. We don't buck every little thing we have a little disagreement about. There must be authority. There must be submission. But my friends, there must be obedience to God. There must be obedience to God. May the Lord bless you today. May the Lord keep you and keep us.